Hello Horror Hounds, welcome back to our film by film look at the works of David Cronenberg, and we're onto a movie now that my perception of it, at least, and I could be wrong, is that it's a bit of a forgotten Cronenberg movie, which is a little strange. It's his first but certainly not last adaptation of a literary work, and it's a Stephen King movie as well, and it's a little bit of a forgotten Stephen King movie. Let's see if we can work out why. It's The Dead Zone.
I bid you welcome.
I welcome you to my house.
Welcome to my house.
Welcome to my home.
So you all know what The Dead Zone's about, right? Johnny Smith is a young English teacher, affianced to another teacher working at the school, and one night he gets into a car accident and ends up in a coma for 5 years. When he comes out of the coma, his entire life has been upended. She's now married with a child. He can't go back to his old job. He can't teach. He's found that he has developed the ability, when he touches people, to see visions, either of their past or predict their future. And some of those futures he can change. He becomes a sort of Fortean cult figure. The press hound him and love this kind of stuff. The more he interacts with people and the more visions he gets, the weaker and the more physically it affects him. So he withdraws completely from society and has to wrestle with the notion of using or ignoring these powers he now has. Gift or curse, it's that old thing. People say that David Cronenberg's movies lack emotion, that they're cold and that they're intellectual. A similar charge is levelled at Stanley Kubrick. And I just don't get it. Sure, The Dead Zone has a chilly winter background. The camera lens is impersonal. It's more of a documentary type of camera than a flashy sort of Tarantino whiz-bang camera, but it's there to observe and record what is an amazing, deeply, movingly emotional movie. So for anyone who says that Cronenberg is all about ideas and isn't interested in the people behind those ideas at all, I think is to fundamentally misunderstand the work of Cronenberg. He's always about how these ideas, these notions, impact when they collide with the physical, with us, with our lives. This, followed by The Fly, followed by Dead Ringers. If you want to say that David Cronenberg is a cold and intellectual filmmaker lacking in emotion, I'll be first in line to call your bluff. On the face of it, at the time, this seems like a strange next step in this burgeoning director's career. This is what Cronenberg himself had to say about why he did The Dead Zone after Videodrome. Videodrome, he said, was a heavy experience. If you're used to comedy, The Dead Zone is a very heavy picture, but if you're used to Videodrome, The Dead Zone is not. At that point, I needed to do something based on someone else's work as a relief. So yes, he is adapting Stephen King's novel, but he is working off someone else's scripts, and I believe in later adaptations he adapts them himself, which is why this is probably the most straightforward adaptation of a literary piece he's ever got his hands on. It's based on a script by Jeffrey Bone, but Cronenberg had an awful lot of input, as did producer Deborah Hill. We'll get on a little bit later maybe to a brief comparison between book and film, but hey, any film that opens with Christopher Walken reciting Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven is A-OK in my book. The cast is now superb. We've talked about his casting and maybe his restrictions in casting previously, and how he seemed to have broken through a glass ceiling there with Videodrome. We're talking now Christopher Walken, and we'll talk about Walken's performance later, but around him, Brooke Adams, who provides in what is essentially a very bleak and melancholy film. Brooke Adams provides a spark of absolute light and joy. It's in her eyes, it's in her smile. It's absolutely necessary. She has maybe a fairly thankless task of playing the wife, the girlfriend. She's wholly necessary for the movie. Tom Skerritt's in there as the sheriff. Really, I think, enjoying getting a little bit more to do than sometimes he's given to do. Herbert Lom takes what could have been a very nothing role as Christopher Walken's doctor and imbues that again with an emotion and a life and a sort of human empathy that, like Brooke Adams' performance, counterbalances the withdrawn, reclusive Johnny Smith that Christopher Walken plays, the fractured and broken humanity that's there. And way the other end of the scale, you've got Martin Sheen as Greg Stilson, who in contemporary reviews I read said that uniformly the acting was brilliant, apart from Martin Sheen, who went a little bit broad as this sort of presidential candidate, congressional candidate in the film, and then in a flash forward we see him as actual president. I wonder now, and I'm not going to go there, but I wonder now if anyone in 2019 would suggest that his performance was too broad. I don't think so. At the time, The Dead Zone seemed like a real outlier film for Cronenberg. Didn't really seem to sit in with his canon at all, especially after this he goes on to make The Fly, which more comfortably aligns itself, I think, with, on a surface level, things like Videodrome and Shivers. Strangely though, for a film about predicting the future, I think The Dead Zone did hint at a new strain of Cronenberg to come. The types of movies that would later emerge in sort of the next portion of his career. Films like Dead Ringers, Spider especially, A History of Violence. Films that are more dramatic, restrained, where the drama is much more driven by character and much more internal. As time goes on, The Dead Zone seems less and less like an unlikely film for Cronenberg to have been made, and more like a signpost to the kind of films he would make in the future. Cronenberg worked very closely with screenwriter Jeffrey Boam to really streamline the script and narrow in more on Johnny Smith and cut out all the as much Greg Stilson stuff and the Castle Rock Killer stuff as possible. All the reports I've read said that early drafts and other people's takes, including King's own take on adapting The Dead Zone, focus more on the more outre stuff, the more reliably horror stuff, more Castle Rock Killer victims, more of young Greg Stilson and the like. And what Boam and Cronenberg did was essentially strip all of that out and make the focus Johnny Smith. And my God, when you then put Christopher Walken in the skin of Johnny Smith and just put the camera on the man's face, that's where the magic is. That's where the story, that's where the heart and soul of the story is. In the book, and I've not read the book, so I'm taking all of this secondhand from other reviews I've read and sort of book and film comparisons. So mea culpa there. But in the book, after withdrawing from society, Johnny Smith serves as a tutor for a wealthy young man called Chuck, who drives a Corvette apparently. Cronenberg changes that detail, and instead of Chuck, we get a reserved, emotionally withdrawn preteen named Chris, who perhaps for Johnny represents the son, the family he never had, was denied with Sarah. Through that small change, we can align ourselves more deeply, more emotionally with Johnny. We can feel as he feels, as he makes a connection with this withdrawn young boy, as he himself is withdrawn. One of the first real connections he makes in the world out there after he comes out of his coma. In the book, Johnny Smith's powers come from a brain tumour that will eventually kill him. So when he comes to decide to assassinate Stilson, at that point in the story he's got nothing to lose, he's dying. Cronenberg and Bohm keep the assassination idea but omit the death sentence, or that particular death sentence, for Johnny. Johnny knows it's a different kind of death sentence. When he goes into it, he won't get out of it because he will be shot and he will be killed. And it might seem on the surface that the idea of a brain tumour causing these visions is right up Cronenberg's alley and the kind of thing that he would keep in the story. I think it's very telling that he chooses to excise it from the story and have, because I believe in the book it's very strongly hinted at that Johnny Smith has this ability before his accident. It's not sort of accident brings out this nascent ability. It might be there slightly in the film, but very much these abilities are new to him and newly revealed to him after the accident and after he comes out of his coma. But I read a fascinating review that suggested that the idea of disease is there, it's just not in this obvious sort of ham-fisted brain tumour metaphor. The accident and the coma have already destroyed his emotional life. His visions affect him physically, breaking him down each time he uses them, eating away at him like a cancer. He could stop. He could withdraw from life, and he tries to, and live out the rest of his days in seclusion, without the inevitable end that the book's Johnny faces of death by brain tumour. Film Johnny's assassination attempt becomes more of a sacrifice. It becomes, in a strange way, more affecting and more heroic. At its time of release, The Dead Zone's lack of body horror, extreme makeup, extreme visual metaphors that Cronenberg had been building a career on naturally made it seem out of pace with the rest of his body of work at that point. Perhaps that is why it's a forgotten Cronenberg movie, a forgotten Stephen King movie. It is, after all, sandwiched between Videodrome and The Fly, and that is quite some company to keep. We've got the benefit of hindsight, though. We can see much more the shape of Cronenberg's career in totality from our lofty seat in 2019, a view that wasn't afforded his hardcore fans in 1983. How were they to know that this man who invented sex parasites would go on to make something like Spider with Ralph Fiennes? Cronenberg said something along the lines of Christopher Walken's face was all the special effects that he needed. He realised as filming went on that all he needed to do was film Christopher Walken. And I've seen The Dead Zone a few times now, and I don't want this to sound patronising to younger viewers, because it's absolutely not intended to be. It's only now, maybe in my 40s, when you've built up maybe a higher stack of regrets than you have was during your 20s. You can watch this in your 20s, and you can. I'm not saying younger people won't get this by any stretch of the imagination. I'm not that patronising. But as you change, the films you watch change. So I've watched The Dead Zone before, and I've enjoyed The Dead Zone before. But this last time watching it affected me much more deeply than any previous watch. It's an incredibly sad movie. It's an incredibly moving movie. Christopher Walken gives an absolute powerhouse of a performance that you have to pay attention to. The moments he chooses to smile, the moments he doesn't smile, the times he crinkles his eyes, the times he chooses to speak and the times he chooses to say silence, speak absolute volumes. This time around I was mesmerised and entranced by this ultimately very heartfelt and extremely tragic story. And Cronenberg will ride that wave with his next film, another deeply tragic, personal and heartfelt story. Perhaps we should use our perspective of Cronenberg's career now to bring The Dead Zone back in from the cold. Perhaps it's time for the ice of opinion to break just a little, allowing us to acknowledge one of the strongest Stephen King adaptations out there, to acknowledge a director testing his skill at restraint and the exploration of the inner lives of very real characters and succeeding. And also finally to acknowledging Christopher Walken, one of the most nuanced, fascinating and engaging screen performances of a generation.